In 1903, Thomas Edison predicted that the doctor of the future would give no medicine, but would instead instruct their patient in the care of the human frame, in diet, and in the cause and prevention of disease. 101 years later, the American College of Lifestyle Medicine was born. We still prescribe drugs when necessary, but our emphasis is based on the understanding that the leading causes of disability in the United States, and the leading causes of death, are caused mostly by lifestyle, particularly what we put in our mouth, food and cigarettes. An impressive number of studies have shown that lifestyle is the root cause of what ails us. The good news, though, is that by changing our lifestyle, we can dramatically improve our health. We have the power. For most leading causes of death, we've long known that our genes account for, at most, 10 to 20% of risk, given the fact that rates of killers like heart disease and major cancers differ up to 100-fold among various populations, and that when people migrate from low-risk to high-risk countries, their disease rates almost always change to those of the new environment. For example, at least 70% of strokes and colon cancer are avoidable, over 80% of coronary heart disease, over 90% of type 2 diabetes, avoidable. So maybe it's time we stop blaming our genes and focus on the 70% plus under our control. That may be the real solution to the healthcare crisis. And it doesn't take much. Adhering to just 4 simple healthy lifestyle factors can have a strong impact on the prevention of chronic diseases. Not smoking, not being obese, half-hour exercise a day, and eating healthier, like more fruits, veggies, whole grains, less meat. 4 simple things cut our risk of developing a chronic disease by 78%. 95% of disease risk out the window, 80% of heart attack risk gone, half a stroke risk, a third of cancer risk simply gone. Think of what that means in terms of the numbers. As it stands now, each year, 1 million Americans experiences their first heart attack or stroke. 1 million get diabetes, 1 million get cancer. If we clean up our act, do we actually get to live longer too? Well, the CDC followed about 8,000 Americans 20 years or older for about 6 years. They found that 3 cardinal lifestyle behaviors exerted an enormous impact on mortality. People who do not smoke, consume a healthy diet, and engage in sufficient physical activity can substantially reduce their risk of early death. And by not smoking, they just meant not currently smoking. By healthy diet, they just meant in the top 40% in terms of complying with the rather wimpy federal dietary guidelines. And physically active meant averaging about 21 minutes a day or more of at least moderate exercise. Those that managed at least one of the 3 had a 40% lower risk of dying. Those that hit 2 out of 3 cut their chances of dying more than half, and those that scored all 3 flushed 82% of their chances of dying in those 6 years down the drain. What does that mean in terms of how much longer we get to live? A similar study on health behaviors and survival didn't just take people's word on how healthy they were eating. They measured the level of vitamin C in people's blood as a biomarker for how many plants people were eating. And the drop in mortality risk in those nailing all 4 healthy behaviors was equivalent to being 14 years younger. It's like turning back the clock 14 years. Physical inactivity has been called the biggest public health problem of the 21st century. Of course, just because someone calls it that doesn't mean it's true. In fact, physical inactivity ranks down at number 5 in terms of risk factors for death, and number 6 in terms of risk factors for disability. Diet is by far our greatest killer, followed by smoking. But still, there is irrefutable evidence of the effectiveness of regular physical activity in the prevention of several chronic diseases: cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer, hypertension, obesity, depression, and osteoporosis, as well as premature death, adding an additional 1 or 2 years onto our lifespan, helping to add years to our life, and above all, life to our years. It truly may be survival of the fittest. How much do we need to exercise? In general, the answer is the more the better. Currently, most health and fitness organizations advocate a minimum of 1,000 calories burned of exercise a week, which is like walking an hour a day, 5 days a week. But 7 days a week may be even better in terms of extending one's lifespan. Moderate intensity can be practically defined by the talk but not sing test, where you can still carry on a conversation, but would feel breathless if trying to sing. Exercise is so important that not walking an hour a day is considered a high-risk behavior, alongside smoking, excess drinking, and being obese. Having any one of these effectively ages us 3 to 5 years in terms of risk of dying prematurely. Though interestingly, those that ate green vegetables on a daily basis did not appear to have that same bump in risk. But even if broccoli-eating couch potatoes do live as long as walkers, there are a multitude of ancillary health benefits to physical activity. So much so that doctors are encouraged to prescribe it, to signal to the patient that exercise is medicine, in fact, powerful medicine. Researchers at the London School, Harvard, and Stanford compared exercise to drug interventions, and found that exercise often worked just as well as drugs for the treatment of heart disease and stroke, the prevention of diabetes. Of course, there's not a lot of money to fund exercise studies, so one option would be to require drug companies to compare any new drug to exercise. In cases where drug options provide only modest benefit, patients deserve to understand the relative impact that physical activity might have on their condition. We could throw diet into the mix too. Yes, the FDA could tell drug companies, your new drug beats out placebo, but does it work as well as kale? The largest study in history of those eating plant-based diets recently compared the nutrient profiles of about 30,000 non-vegetarians to 20,000 vegetarians, and about 5,000 vegans, flexitarians, and no-meat except fish eaters, allowing us to finally put to rest the perennial question, do vegetarians get enough protein? The average requirement is 42 grams of protein a day. Non-vegetarians get way more than they need, and so does everyone else. On average, vegetarians and vegans get 70% more protein than they need every day. Surprising that there's so much fuss about protein in this country when less than 3% of adults don't make the cut, presumably folks on extreme calorie-restricted diets who just aren't eating enough food, period. But 97% of Americans get enough protein. There is a nutrient, though, for which 97% of Americans are deficient. Now that's a problem nutrient. That's something we really have to work on. Less than 3% of Americans get even the recommended minimum adequate intake of fiber. So the question isn't where do you get your protein, but where do you get your fiber? We only get about 15 grams a day. The minimum daily requirement is 31.5, so we get less than half the minimum. If you break it down by age and gender, after studying the diets of 12,761 Americans, the percentage of men between ages 14 and 50 getting the minimum adequate intake, 0. This deficit is stunning, in that dietary fiber has been protectively associated with the risk of diabetes, metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease, obesity, and various cancers, as well as high cholesterol, blood pressure, and blood sugars. Therefore, it is not surprising that fiber is now listed as a nutrient of concern in the dietary guidelines. Protein is not. One problem is that most people have no idea what's in their food. More than half of Americans think steak is a significant fiber source. By definition, fiber is only found in plants. There's no fiber in meat, dairy, or eggs, and little or no fiber in junk food. Therein lies the problem. Americans should be eating more beans, vegetables, fruits, whole grains. How are we doing on that? Well, 96% of Americans don't eat the recommended minimum daily intake of beans. 96% don't eat the measly minimum for greens. 99% don't get enough whole grains. Look at these numbers. Nearly the entire U.S. population fails to eat enough whole plant foods, and it's not getting any better. A lack of progress that's disappointing. Even semi-vegetarians, though, make the minimum for fiber, and those eating completely plant-based diets triple the average American intake. Now, when closing the fiber gap, you want to do it gradually, no more than about 5 extra grams of fiber a day each week until you can kind of work your way up, but it's worth it. Plant-derived diets tend to contribute significantly less fat, saturated fat, cholesterol, foodborne pathogens, while at the same time offering more fiber, folate, vitamin C, phytochemicals, all essential factors for disease prevention and optimal health and well-being. And the more plant foods, the better. Whole plant foods, the better. If you compare the nutritional quality of vegan versus vegetarian, semi-vegetarian, pesco-vegetarian, and omnivorous diets, traditional healthy diet indexing systems, like compliance with the dietary guidelines, consistently indicate the most plant-based diet as the most healthy one. Haggis, the national dish of Scotland, is a savory pudding of heart, liver, lungs, and oatmeal, traditionally stuffed inside of a stomach. When that stomach goes into our own stomach, our digestive enzymes and stomach acid have no problem digesting it away. But how come our body digests the stomach lining of a sheep on our plate without digesting our own stomach lining? It's meat, we're meat. Why don't we digest our own stomach every time we eat? In part because we have an enzyme called cyclooxygenase that protects the lining of our stomach. There are 2 types, COX-1 and COX-2. Cyclooxygenase 1 is thought to be the main protector of our stomach, whereas COX-2 is an enzyme responsible for pain and inflammation. In fact, that's how anti-inflammatory drugs like ibuprofen and naproxen work, by inhibiting the COX-2 enzyme. But these are non-selective drugs. They inhibit both COX-2 and COX-1, which is trying to protect our stomach lining. That's why, though drugs like ibuprofen are great at relieving pain and inflammation, they kill thousands every year due to ulcerations through the stomach wall, resulting in life-threatening bleeding and perforation. What are the risks on an individual level? On average, about 1 in about 1,200 people who take this class of drugs for at least 2 months will die as a result. To put this into perspective, we can compare the death rate from anti-inflammatory drug side effects to the risks associated with some well-known events. For example, it may be safer to go bungee jumping a few hundred times. So what we need is some sort of selective COX-2 inhibitor, inhibiting the pain and inflammation of COX-2 without inhibiting the stomach protection of COX-1. And that's what we got, anti-inflammatory drugs easier on the stomach, like Vioxx, blockbuster drug bought in billions in profits before it started killing tens of thousands of people. Internal emails show how the drug manufacturer responded to the revelation they were killing people. They drew up a list of doctors who were trying to warn people and tried to neutralize them. And if that didn't work, discredit them. So is that what we're left with? Death from internal bleeding from one type of drug, or death from side effects from another type of drug? If only there was some sort of natural COX-2 inhibitor. There is. Cherries, which, unlike ibuprofen, suppress COX-2 more than COX-1. In videos I did on insomnia and reducing muscle soreness, I talked about the benefits of sour cherries, the types of cherries used in baking. But this was for the sweet cherries you eat fresh. Tart cherries had less of an effect. Sweet, regular, red Bing cherries were shown to have a greater anti-inflammatory activity than tart cherries. Which makes sense, since we think it may be the anthocyanin and phytonutrients in cherries, and there's lots more in sweet red cherries than in tart, and nearly none in the yellow Rainier cherries. Because fresh cherries have limited availability, what about other cherry products? Fresh is best, but frozen would appear to be the second best choice. The Fruit Commission of Washington State, our largest cherry producer, can fund reviews cherry-picking studies on the anti-inflammatory effects of cherries in a petri dish and animal models, but what we need are human studies. For example, if you stuff the human equivalent of up to 1,000 cups of cherries down the throats of rats, it appears to have an anti-inflammatory effect, but we couldn't eat that many, and in fact, if we tried, it could end up badly. This is a case report of a poor guy who ate 500 cherries whole without spitting out the pits, which ended up fatally obstructing his colon. But we didn't have many human studies until now. Men and women were asked to eat about 45 cherries a day for a month. I wouldn't mind being part of that study. 25% drop in C-reactive protein levels, as well as an inflammatory protein with an inelegant acronym, regulated on and activation normal, T-cell expressed and secreted. That's actually the name. As you can see, even a month after the study ended, there appeared to be residual anti-inflammatory benefit from the Cherry Fest. Now, these were all healthy people with low levels of inflammation to begin with, but the same was found in a follow-up study on folks with higher levels, a solid 20% drop in C-reactive protein, and a number of other markers for chronic inflammatory diseases. But how about trying out cherries on people who actually have a chronic inflammatory disease to see if they actually work? Well, back in 1950, in an obscure Texas medical journal, observations made by responsible physicians suggested that in a dozen patients with gout, eating half a pound of fresh or canned cherries helped prevent flares of gout, but it had never been seriously tested until now. Gout is an excruciatingly painful inflammatory arthritis caused by the crystallization of uric acid in our joints, affecting 8 million Americans. Such attacks cause tremendous pain, as famously captured in this caricature. Hundreds of gout sufferers studied, and cherry intake was associated with a 35% lower risk of gout attacks, with over half the risk gone at 3 servings, measured over a 2-day period, which comes out to be about 16 cherries a day. That's the kind of efficacy they saw with a low-purine diet. Uric acid is a breakdown product of purines. The same research group found that purine intake of animal origin increased the odds for recurrent gout attacks by nearly 5-fold. Heavy alcohol consumption isn't a good idea either. Now, there are some high-purine non-animal foods, like mushrooms and asparagus, but they found no significant link to plant sources of purines, so they recommended eliminating meat and seafood from the diet. That may decrease risk, and adding cherries on top may decrease risk of gout attacks even further. Same thing with the leading drug. Allopurinol works, but pills and produce appear to work even better. And dietary changes in cherries may be all many patients have, as doctors are hesitant to prescribe uric acid-lowering drugs like allopurinol due to rare but serious side effects, including the most feared of all drug side effects, Stevens-Johnson syndrome, which can detach our skin from our body. I will spare you the photos. In addition to fighting inflammation, cherries may actually help lower uric acid levels as well. Within 5 hours of eating a big bowl of cherries, uric acid levels in the blood significantly drop. At the same time, antioxidant levels in the blood go up as vitamin C levels start to rise. So is it just an antioxidant effect? I mean, would other fruit work just as well? No. They tried grapes, strawberries, and kiwi fruit, and none significantly lowered uric acid levels, supporting a specific anti-gout effect of cherries. There are some new gout drugs out now, costing up to $2,000 per dose, and also carries a risk of toxicity that may be avoided by using non-pharmacological treatments or prevention in the first place. Given the potential harms and high costs, attention ought to be directed to dietary modification, reducing alcohol and meat intake, particularly sardines and organ meats, and hey, if life serves up a bowl of cherries consumed on a regular basis, the risk of a recurrent gout attack may be meaningfully reduced. Delayed onset muscle soreness is the discomfort that starts the day after a particularly grueling workout. Micro tears in the muscle lead to inflammation, and so the leading pharmaceutical intervention is over-the-counter NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like ibuprofen, provided people are offered a reasonable guidance on the dangers of their use. The use of NSAIDs is associated with serious upper and lower gastrointestinal side effects, including upset stomach, stomach ulcers, stomach and intestinal bleeding, and perforation. Of all the NSAIDs, ibuprofen is probably safest, significantly safer than naproxen. Still, there may be about a 1 in 100 chance we'll end up at our doctor's with some problem, and up to about 1 in 500 chance we could end up in the hospital because of taking simple over-the-counter ibuprofen. And that's mostly for the stomach. NSAID drugs also can damage the small intestine. Within hours of taking ibuprofen, it can make our gut leaky, and within days inflame our bowels. Up until the mid-'80s, we thought the small intestine was relatively unaffected by these drugs, but now we know they may disrupt our intestinal barrier function. There's got to be a better way to deal with muscle soreness. Previously, I reviewed the role cherries may play in reducing muscle soreness, thought to be because of anti-inflammatory flavonoid nutrients. Interestingly, while the absorption of these phytonutrients can help with exercise, exercise may help with the absorption of these phytonutrients. Here's the absorption of fruit phytonutrients in sedentary volunteers. Compare that to how much triathletes get from the same amount of fruit. If you look at each of the individual phytonutrients they looked at, they were all significantly better absorbed by the athletes. The thought is that elite training may modify the activity of the good bacteria in our gut, which then boosts bioavailability. But back to muscle soreness. Any other fruit that may help? Watermelon. Researchers in Spain had a group of men engage in intense physical activity after drinking 2 cups of fresh blended watermelon, or a watermelon-free placebo drink, and the next day those that preloaded with watermelon were significantly less sore, around 1 on a scale of 1 to 5 compared to closer to 2 after placebo. They conclude that functional compounds in fruits and vegetables can play a key role in the design of new natural products by the food industry, instead of synthetic compounds from the pharmaceutical industry. But why design new natural products when nature already designed the products we need? Cadmium is known as a highly toxic metal that represents a major hazard to human health. It sticks around in our body for decades because our body has no efficient way to get rid of it, and may contribute to a variety of illnesses, including heart disease, cancer, and diabetes. Most recently, data suggest cadmium exposure may impair cognitive performance even at levels once thought to be safe. Recent studies suggest cadmium exposure may produce adverse health effects at lower exposure levels than previously predicted, including increased risk of hormonal cancers. For example, researchers on Long Island estimated that about 40% of breast cancer in the U.S. may be associated with elevated cadmium levels. Inhalation of cigarette smoke is one of the major routes for human exposure to cadmium. Seafood consumption is another dominant route of human exposure, in this study even more so than from cigarette smoke. The highest levels, though, are found in organ meats. But how many horse kidneys can you eat? Because people eat so few organs, grains and vegetables actually end up contributing the largest amount. But wait a second, whole grains and vegetables are among the major dietary sources of fiber, phytoestrogens, antioxidants that may protect against breast cancer. And indeed, even though the risk of breast cancer goes up as women consume more and more cadmium, even though on paper most cadmium comes from grains and vegetables, breast cancer risk goes down the more whole grains and vegetables women eat. So maybe the animal-sourced cadmium is somehow worse, or the benefits of the plant foods just overwhelm any adverse effects of the cadmium? This study may have helped solve the mystery. It's not what we eat, it's what we absorb. cadmium bioavailability from animal-based foods may be higher than from vegetable-based foods. There appears to be something in plants that inhibits cadmium absorption. In fact, if you add kale to your boiled pig kidneys, you can cut down on toxic exposure. Just 1 tablespoon of pig kidney, we may exceed the daily safety limit unless we eat kale, in which case we could eat a whole quarter cup. The pronounced effects of the inhibitory factors in kale points out the importance of vegetable foods in terms of prevention of health hazards from cadmium ingested as mixed diets in a real situation. Even if a vegetarian diet contains more lead and cadmium than a mixed diet, it's not certain that it'll give rise to higher uptake of the metals because the absorption of lead and cadmium is inhibited by plant compounds such as fiber and phytate. And it's not just in lab animals. Having whole grains in our stomach up to 3 hours before we swallow lead can eliminate 90% of absorption, thought to be due to phytates in whole grains, beans, and nuts grabbing onto it. So vegetarians may have lower levels even though they have higher intakes. In fact, a significant decrease in the hair concentrations of lead and cadmium was seen after the change from an omnivorous to a vegetarian diet, indicating a lower absorption of the metals. Here's that study. They took folks eating a standard Swedish diet and put them on a vegetarian diet. Lots of whole, unrefined plant foods, no meat, poultry, fish, eggs, and junk food was discouraged. Here's where they started out. A measure of their mercury levels, cadmium level, and lead levels in their bodies. Within 3 months on a vegetarian diet, their levels significantly dropped, and stayed down for the rest of the year-long experiment. But then they came back 3 years later, 3 years after they stopped eating vegetarian. And what did they find? Their levels of mercury, cadmium, and lead shot back up. Since the cadmium in plants is based on the cadmium in soil, plant eaters that live in a really polluted area like Slovakia, which has some of the highest levels, the so-called black triangle of pollution, thanks to the chemical and smelting industries. Those who eat lots of plants there can indeed build up higher cadmium levels, especially if you eat lots of plants. It's interesting, in spite of the significantly higher blood cadmium concentrations as a consequence of greater cadmium intake from polluted plants, all the antioxidants in those same plants were found to help inhibit the harmful effects of higher free radical production caused by the cadmium exposure. Still, though, in highly polluted areas, it might be especially a good idea not to smoke or eat too much seafood or organ meats. But even if we live in the Slovak Republic's black triangle of pollution, the benefits of whole plant foods would outweigh the risks. In highly polluted areas, zinc supplements may decrease cadmium absorption, but I'd recommend against multi-mineral supplements, as they've been found to be contaminated with cadmium itself. The low incidence of large and small bowel cancer in India is often attributed to natural antioxidants such as curcumin in the diet, the yellow pigment in the spice turmeric, which is used in curry powder. However, it's imperative to recall that beneficial effects attributed to diets are seldom reproduced by administration of a single ingredient in that diet. For example, diets rich in beta-carotene lower the risk of tobacco-related cancers, but the administration of beta-carotene pills does not. That doesn't stop researchers from trying, though. Back in 2001, in a last-ditch attempt to save the lives of 15 patients with advanced colorectal cancer that didn't respond to any of the standard chemotherapy agents or radiation, they started them on a turmeric extract. It appeared to help stall the disease in a third of the patients, 5 out of 15, suggesting turmeric extract may cause clinical benefit in at least some patients with advanced refractory colorectal cancer. Now, if we were talking about some new kind of chemo, and it only helped 1 in 3, you'd have to weigh that against chemo side effects, losing your hair, sloughing of your gut, intractable vomiting, maybe being bedridden. So in a drug scenario, a 1 in 3 benefit may not sound particularly appealing, but when we're talking about a plant extract shown to be remarkably safe, even if it just helped 1 in 100, it'd be worth considering. With no serious downsides, a 1 in 3 benefit for end-stage cancer is pretty exciting. To see if colon cancer could be prevented, 5 years later, researchers at the Cleveland Clinic and Hopkins tested 2 phytochemicals, curcumin from turmeric, and quercetin, found in red onions and red wine, in people with familial adenomatous polyposis. Colon cancer forms from polyps, and there's this disease that runs in families in which you develop hundreds of polyps, which will eventually turn into cancer unless you have your colon prophylactically removed. So they took 5 such patients who already had their colons removed, but still either had their rectum or a little intestinal pouch, which were still packed with polyps. This is where they started out, between 5 and 45 polyps each, and this is where they ended up after 6 months of curcumin and quercetin supplements. On average, ended up with fewer than half the polyps, and the ones that they had shrunk in half. Here's a representative endoscopic photograph before and after. Kind of now you see it, now you don't. But what about patient 1? Got rid of all their polyps by month 3, but then they seemed to come back. So they asked them what's what, and it turned out the patient stopped taking the supplements. Darn it, so they put them back on the phytonutrient supplements for another 3 months, and the polyps came back down. All with virtually no adverse events and no blood test abnormalities. By studying people at high risk for colon cancer, they were able to show noticeable effects within just months. But polyposis is a rare disease. They were only able to recruit 5 people for the study. Thankfully, smokers are a dime a dozen. Another 5 years later, researchers put 44 smokers on turmeric curcumin supplements alone for a month, and measured changes in their colorectal aberrant crypt foci, which may act like precursors to polyps, which are the precursors to cancer. And we can see after just 1 month, there was a significant drop in the number of these aberrant crypt foci in the high-dose supplement group, but no change in the low-dose group, with no dose-limiting side effects, although the stools in the participants did turn yellow. Researchers showed that those at high risk for colon cancer could reverse the progression of their disease by taking curcumin, the yellow pigment in the spice turmeric, and curry powder, cutting down on precancerous lesions, and even pre-precancerous lesions. Are there other high-risk lesions we can try spicing up? How about giving turmeric extracts to people who just had bladder cancer taken out, or have had early-stage squamous cell carcinoma skin cancer caused by arsenic exposure, or early-stage cervical cancer, or precancerous lesions in the mouth or the stomach? In about a quarter of the patients, the lesions started to get better. 1 out of the 2 bladder cancer survivors, 2 out of 7 precancerous mouth lesions, 1 out of 6 precancerous stomach lesions, 1 out of the 4 early-stage cervical cancer cases, and 2 out of 6 early-stage skin cancer, all without noticeable side effects. One of the reasons it may work better in some cancers than others, or some people better than others, is differences in bioavailability. Megadoses were given, and just a tiny amount ended up in their bloodstream. If you're treating skin cancer, though, why not just put the curcumin directly on the skin? I've talked about what turmeric compounds can do to cancer cells in a petri dish. Here's some before and after pics. These are cervical cancer cells in a petri dish with more and more curcumin. Normal cells are unharmed, but cancer cells are laid to waste. Yeah, but to make it to the cervix, curcumin must be absorbed unless a vaginal cream was invented. See, a variety of delivery methods have now been devised. Besides intravaginal, there's also oral, intra-abdominal, intramuscular, under-the-skin injection, straight into the veins or the arteries, on the skin, up the bladder and the nose, breathed in like an inhaler, up where the sun don't shine, or straight into the spinal column, bone marrow, the tumor itself, or implanted somehow. Taken orally, some of it does actually get into the tissue. You can measure the amount of curcumin absorbed into the wall of the intestine by examining biopsies and surgical specimens taken after a curcumin regimen. It makes sense to take turmeric orally to treat colon cancer, but if we have cancer erupting on our skin, why not just rub it on directly? And that's what these researchers did. Turmeric and curcumin as topical agents in cancer therapy. They just took some turmeric from the store, made a tincture out of it, dried it, put it in Vaseline, and then had cancer patients rub it on their cancer 3 times a day. What kind of cancer can you get at with a finger? These were folks with cancers of the mouth, breast, skin, vulva, and elsewhere. Isn't breast cancer under the skin? Not always. Advanced breast cancer can ulcerate right through the skin. And these were all people with recurrent ulcerating tumors that had failed to respond to surgery, radiation, and chemo. And these open cancers can stink and itch and ooze. There was nothing else modern medicine had to offer. So let's rub on some turmeric ointment and see what happens. It produced remarkable relief. A reduction in smell was noted in 90% of the cases, even in extensively ulcerated cases of breast cancer, and a reduction in itching in almost all cases as well, for example, relieving the severe itching in 2 of the vulva cancer patients. Most of the lesions dried up, and in many cases this relief lasted for months, all from just rubbing on some harmless spikes turmeric, which they describe as an indigenous drug, highly effective in reducing smell, itching, and exudate. The effect of the so-called drug is remarkable, and that drug is just some edible spice used in curries for centuries. How else can we make decisions for ourselves and our families but by the best available balance of evidence? The latest meta-analysis, pooling data from more than a dozen studies involving more than 300,000 people, indicates that there's a dose-dependent association between egg consumption and the risk of cardiovascular disease and diabetes. But that doesn't mean every single individual study showed evidence of harm. Even though the totality of evidence points to harm, the egg industry can certainly cherry-pick out studies that show no apparent effects. If eggs are harmful, though, why don't all studies on heart disease and egg consumption show significant harm? It may have to do with Rose's concept of a sick population. If an entire population is sick, then the range of quote-unquote health may not be sufficiently broad to establish a significant association. Let me explain. This is one of the most famous papers ever written in preventive medicine. Should be required reading for all medical students. Imagine if everyone smoked 20 cigarettes a day. If everybody smoked, then clinical studies, case control studies, cohort studies would all lead us to conclude that lung cancer was a genetic disease. And in one sense, that would be true, right? Some smokers get cancer, others smoke their whole lives and don't. But if everybody smoked, we'd never know that smoking was a risk factor. Thankfully, in the case of cigarettes and lung cancer, it so happened that the original study populations contained about equal numbers of smokers and non-smokers, and in that situation, studies are able to identify the main risk factor. But take cholesterol. Here's the cholesterol levels of the people without heart disease in the famous Framingham Heart Study. And here's the cholesterol levels of those that did develop heart disease. It's hardly any different, because practically everybody's cholesterol was too high. It's like everyone was a smoker. The painful truth is that even someone at quote-unquote low risk for heart disease is likely to die of heart disease. Everyone who eats the standard Western diet, in fact, is a high-risk individual when it comes to heart disease. In a sick population like ours, where nearly everyone is eating lots of saturated fat and cholesterol, adding some more saturated fat and cholesterol in the form of eggs may just take us from one sorry state, probably dying from heart disease, to another sorry state, still probably dying from heart disease. So when the federal guidelines say we need to really restrict dietary cholesterol, especially if we're at high risk for heart disease, we need to realize that nearly all Americans that live past middle age are at high risk of dying from heart disease. It's our #1 cause of death. A 20-year-old man might feel it's safe to smoke and eat egg yolks because his heart attack is 45 or so years in the future, but why would he want to accelerate the progression of the atherosclerotic plaque to bring it on sooner? Stopping egg yolks after a heart attack would be like quitting smoking after lung cancer is diagnosed. There may in fact be a plateau of risk for smoking too. Whether we smoke for 25 years or 35 years, our risk of lung cancer may be about the same. Really high, but about the same. So the tobacco industry could truthfully tell someone who smoked for most of their lives, for the last 25 years, keep smoking, don't worry. You can keep smoking and your risk of lung cancer won't go up, conveniently just failing to mention that you're already really at high risk, and if you quit completely, your risk would drop dramatically. In the same way, the egg industry can design a study showing that adding eggs doesn't make much of a difference, but make the same convenient omission. Imagine if you took a raging drunk, had them take a shot of whiskey. And someone who's hammered, it might not make much of a difference, but to a teetotaler, a couple shots could have quite an effect. So it's like the alcohol industry with a group of drunks saying, see, couple shots, no big deal. But that doesn't mean it's not better to be sober. Instead of going from high risk to high risk, better to go to low risk or no risk. Interest continues to grow about targeting cancer stem cells with a dietary component of broccoli, and especially broccoli sprouts. Cancer stem cells are thought responsible for initiating and maintaining cancer, which I've talked about in the past. There's also been a number of randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trials on the use of broccoli sprouts as a complementary treatment in diabetes to reduce oxidative stress, reduce inflammation, and reduce insulin resistance and fasting blood sugars. In my video, Biggest Nutrition Bang for Your Buck, I describe how to grow your own, simply and quickly in 5 days. New science suggests, though, that it's even simpler and quicker than I described. If you look at other sprouts, their antioxidant phytonutrients appear to peak around sprouting day 5, up to 10-fold higher than day 2. But the sulforaphane content in broccoli sprouts appears to peak at around 48 hours. So 2-day-old sprouts may be even better. For consumers who do not enjoy eating broccoli or broccoli sprouts, but still want the benefits of the broccoli phytonutrients, what about all the different broccoli supplements on the market? Here they tested BroccoMax, which boasts a half a pound of broccoli's worth in every capsule. They gave people 6 a day, compared to a cup of broccoli sprouts. Here's the spike in broccoli phytonutrients in the bloodstream of those eating sprouts, which would cost about 25 cents a day, compared to 6 capsules of the supplement, which would cost about $2. They conclude that the bioavailability of broccoli phytonutrients is dramatically lower when subjects consume broccoli supplements compared to the whole food. Chocolate. Beauty or the beast, or both? Although cocoa itself is frequently found in foods like chocolate, which can contain high levels of fat and sugar, the cocoa powder itself may have beneficial effects in a number of chronic disease conditions, including heart disease. Flow-mediated dilation, measured in the main artery of the arm, which is about the same caliber as our coronary arteries, is considered one of the best measures of arterial function, a predictor of cardiovascular mortality. A little bit of cocoa doesn't do anything, but a little more, or a lot more, gives one a significant boost in arterial function within hours of consumption. How much does it take? Not much, just a teaspoon of natural cocoa powder, which would be like a tablespoon or more of Dutch cocoa. Now, it makes you a little suspicious that the author works in Hershey, Pennsylvania, at the Hershey Medical Center, and indeed has accepted money from our largest chocolate manufacturer, Center for Health and Nutrition, conveniently located near the intersection of Chocolate and Cocoa Avenues. Putting together all the best available science, though dozens of randomized controlled trials, arterial function was significantly improved within hours and after weeks and months of chronic cocoa consumption. It's always difficult to tease out fact from fiction when such powerful financial interests are involved. Many of these studies were funded by industry as well, and as in all areas of research, evidence suggests that industry funding is associated with pro-industry conclusions. But even after removing those studies funded by industry, they found the same protective effect. The reason they measure arterial function in the arm, rather than where you really need it, the coronary arteries of the heart, is that would require an angiogram, which is a little more invasive. But if you were able to find people already scheduled for an angiogram anyway— here we go. Double-blind, randomized trial finds that dark chocolate actually opens up coronary arteries themselves. And when they did what's called a cold pressor test, where they plunge your hand into a bucket of ice water, which normally causes your arteries to constrict, but after dark chocolate, they dilated. Dark chocolate may also improve blood flow to the heart of our kidneys. Because chocolate also contains fat and sugar, though, we have to be careful. Furthermore, most chocolate products are manufactured with milk, a compound known to influence antioxidant capacity in our blood. Even if milk chocolate had the same flavonoid phytonutrient content as dark chocolate, the antioxidant effect of cocoa is potentially weakened in the blood when milk is consumed. So not only are there triple the antioxidants in dark compared to milk chocolate, but the milk actively works against the effects in the human body. So eat dark chocolate and get a nice spike in the antioxidant power of our bloodstream within an hour. Milk chocolate, nothing. And if you eat that same dark chocolate with a cup of milk, the benefit is suppressed. The addition of milk, either in our stomach or in the chocolate itself, inhibits the within-body antioxidant activity of chocolate and the absorption into the bloodstream of one of the target phytonutrients. Sugar isn't good for us either. Sugar impairs arterial function. One bottle of soda's worth of sugar can temporarily cripple artery function. That's why sugar-free cocoa improves arterial function better than the same amount of cocoa with sugar added. So eliminating sugar appears to amplify the beneficial effects of cocoa. Bottom line, although the positive effects of chocolate and cocoa products seem apparent, precautions exist when we're talking about the calories, fat, and sugar in chocolate. Cocoa powder then offers the best of both worlds. Although not as tasty, cocoa-based products with little or no sugar or fat are certainly preferred. And you can make them tasty, as I note in my healthy chocolate milkshake recipe and my healthy chocolate ice cream video. The food industry enjoys influential positions in surprising places. The American Dietetic Association, the world's largest association of nutrition professionals, is, in its own words, devoted to improving the nation's health. To that end, they promoted a series of nutrition fact sheets. Who writes them? Industry sources pay $20,000 per fact sheet to the ADA and explicitly take part in writing the documents. The ADA then promotes them through its journal and on its website. Some of these fact sheets are What's a Mom to Do? Healthy Eating Tips for Families, sponsored by Wendy's. Lamb, the Essence of Nutrient-Rich Flavor, sponsored by the Try Lamb Group. Cocoa and Chocolate Sweet News, sponsored by the Hershey Center for Health and Nutrition. Eggs, a Good Choice, sponsored by the American Egg Board's Egg Nutrition Center. Adult beverage consumption, making responsible drinking choices in connection with the Distilled Spirits Council, and the benefits of chewing gum, sponsored by the Wrigley Science Institute. I didn't know Wrigley's had a science institute. In 2008, the American Dietetic Association announced that the Coca-Cola Company had become an ADA partner through its Corporate Relations Sponsorship Program. The ADA provides partners a national platform via ADA events and programs with prominent access to key influencers, thought leaders, and decision-makers in the nutrition marketplace. The ADA's press release also pointed out that the Coca-Cola Company will share their research findings with ADA members in forums such as professional meetings and scientific publications. Did you know there are no harmful effects of different Coca-Cola beverages on rat testicles? Was that even a concern? Thou doth protest too much, methinks. When the American Academy of Pediatrics was called out on their proud new corporate relationship with Coke to support patient education on healthy eating. An executive vice president of the Academy tried to quell protest by explaining that this alliance was not without precedent. The American Academy of Pediatrics has had previous relationships with Pepsi and McDonald's for some time, reminiscent of similar types of relationships in the past. The fact that the American Academy of Pediatrics was also collaborating with Pepsi and McDonald's didn't seem to placate the critics, so the exec continued. Even the American Dietetics Association has made a policy statement that there are no good or bad foods. Indeed, that's the ADA's official position. Classification of specific foods as good or bad is overly simplistic. The ADA has taken a strong stand that there are no good foods or bad foods, a position that the food industry has then exploited. In its early years, the tobacco industry sounded a very similar theme. Smoking per se was not bad, only excess smoking. Is that what family doctors have been reduced to? To justify an unholy financial alliance, we hide behind what others say and do, and deny that there are actually unhealthy, bad foods? I wonder how much money the ADA receives from the Coca-Cola Company and other food and beverage companies to have come up with their no good or bad foods philosophy. In 2012, the American Dietetics Association changed their name to the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. Did their policies change at all? A landmark report last year from one of my favorite industry watchdogs found that they continue to take millions of dollars in corporate sponsorship money every year from meat, processed junk, dairy, soda, and candy bar companies, and in return offer official educational seminars to teach dietitians what to say to their clients. So when you hear the title Registered Dietitian, this is the group they're registered with. The rates of dementia differ greatly around the world, from the lowest rates in Africa and India, South Asia, to the highest rates in Western Europe and especially North America. Is it all just genetics? Well, the incidence of dementia and Alzheimer's disease is significantly lower for Africans in Nigeria than for African Americans in Indianapolis, for example, up to 5 times lower. Alzheimer's rates for Japanese Americans living in the U.S. are closer to that of Americans than to Japanese. So when people of one ethnic group move from their homeland to the United States, Alzheimer's rates can increase dramatically. Therefore, when Africans or Asians live in the U.S. and adopt a Western diet, their increase in Alzheimer's risk suggests that it's not the genetics. Unfortunately, one doesn't have to move to the West to adopt a Western diet. The prevalence of dementia in Japan has shot up over the last few decades. Mechanisms to explain this in Japan include increases in cholesterol, saturated fat, and iron from increases in the consumption of animal products. Traditional diets generally are weighted towards vegetable products such as grains, and away from animal products. But since 1960, the diet in Japan has changed from a more traditional rice-based diet to one with a preponderance of meat. From 1961 to 2008, meat and animal fat increased considerably, whereas the rice supply dropped. The dietary factor most strongly associated with the rise in Alzheimer's disease in Japan was the increased consumption of animal fat. A similar analysis in China arrived at the same conclusion. On the basis of these findings, the rate of Alzheimer's disease and dementia will continue to rise unless dietary patterns change to those with less reliance on animal products. This is consistent with data showing that those who eat vegetarian appear 2 to 3 times less likely to become demented, and the longer one eats meat-free, the lower the associated risk of dementia. Globally, the lowest validated rates of Alzheimer's in the world are rural India, where they eat low-meat, high-grain, high-bean, high-carb diets. Now, it's possible the apparent protective association between rice and Alzheimer's is more likely due to the fact that the drop of rice consumption associated with increasing Alzheimer's was accompanied by a rise in meat consumption. but other population studies have found that dietary grains appear strongly protective in relation to Alzheimer's disease. In other words, perhaps, don't pass on the grain, pass the grain to spare the brain. Sweet potatoes can be considered a superfood, one of the healthiest vegetables on the planet, and one day perhaps even off the planet, as NASA has chosen it for space missions. One of the healthiest and cheapest. The study aimed to identify which vegetables provided the most nutrients per dollar. If you look at a graph of affordability versus nutrition, you can see that the healthiest foods, like dark green leafy vegetables, may also be among the cheapest, and the highest nutrient-rich food scores per dollar were obtained for sweet potatoes. They're not just packed with nutrition, but may have special cancer-fighting properties. In 1931, a unique protein was discovered in sweet potatoes, later renamed. 80% of the protein in sweet potatoes is a type of protease inhibitor with potential anti-cancer effects. It was originally tested against leukemia cells and appears to suppress the growth of leukemia cells in a petri dish, but how would a sweet potato protein ever get into our bloodstream? As soon as most proteins hit our stomach, they start getting digested. So they tried sweet potato protein against tongue cancer. Sweet potato constituents certainly come in contact with our mouth. Tongue cancer is often treated with chemo. However, most of the chemo drugs for tongue cancer have great aversive side effects, so it is indispensable for us to find other therapeutic strategies. Sweet potato protein rapidly diminished viability of the cancer within a matter of days, leading them to propose that sweet potato may be useful for human tongue cancer, but presumably not much else? Remarkably, though, this class of proteins doesn't just survive digestion, but may be absorbed into the bloodstream intact, in at least 2 of the 9 women with advanced cervical cancer they tried giving it to. So, most recently, it was tried on colorectal cancer cells, one of our most common and deadly cancers. Normally, we just surgically remove the colon, but that only works in the early stages, since there are often micrometastases outside the colon that can subsequently lead to cancer recurrence and death. And so we've started searching for anti-metastatic agents. And not only does sweet potato protein slow down the growth of colon cancer cells, but decreases cancer cell migration and invasion. Though sweet potato consumption has been associated with lower gallbladder cancer rates, it's never been directly put to the test. But what's the downside? The only potential downside of eating sweet potatoes is if you eat too much, you could get a yellow nose. It's called carotenemia. It's a common harmless condition due to elevated levels of beta-carotene in the blood. First noticed a century ago when carrots were introduced into infant diets. It's treated mostly by just reassuring parents that it's harmless, but if you don't want your child's nose to be yellow, you can decrease their beta-carotene intake. In a few months it'll be gone. But color is what we're looking for. When picking out varieties at the supermarket, the intensity of the yellow or orange flesh color of the sweet potato is directly correlated to its nutritional content, so the more intense, the better. Though if you really want intensity, sweet potato varieties range not only from white to yellow and orange, but to pink and very to deep purple, the natural pigments of which may have special anti-cancer effects of their own. What's the best way to cook sweet potatoes? Boiling may actually best retain the antioxidant power of sweet potatoes compared to roasting and steaming. If you compare baking to boiling microscopically, boiling helps thin out the cell walls and gelatinize the starch, which may enhance the bioavailability of nutrients. While at the same time, the glycemic index of boiled sweet potatoes was found to be only about half that of baking or roasting, so boiled gives one less of a blood sugar spike. Make sure to keep the skin on, though. The peel of a sweet potato has nearly 10 times the antioxidant power as the flesh, an antioxidant capacity comparable to that of blueberries, though it really takes a hit when baked, wiping out over 2/3, whereas microwaving or boiling was comparatively much gentler. The same with the rest of the sweet potato. Baking can cause an 80% drop in vitamin A levels, twice as much as boiling. So from a nutritional standpoint, boiling rather than baking can be recommended for sweet potato cooking. Boiling may be best, but sweet potatoes are so incredibly healthy, the best way to prepare them is whichever way will get you to eat the most of them, with the exception of deep frying, which can lead to the formation of acrylamide, a potential human carcinogen. Modern Americans are described as eating breakfast in their cars, lunch at their desks, and chicken from a bucket. Within the last few decades, Americans are eating out more and more, and cooking fewer meals at home. And food prepared at home tends to be healthier. Less saturated fat, cholesterol, and sodium, more fiber. And so the benefits to preparing healthful food at home may include chronic disease prevention. But even during the recession, folks were found resistant to dietary change and kept going out to eat, or bringing it home. Almost half of all fast food eaten by children is eaten at home, so just because they're technically eating at home doesn't mean they're eating healthy. Even when food is prepared at home, it still may not mean much, as most dinners were found to incorporate processed commercial foods. Microwaving a frozen pizza ain't exactly home cooking. One of the problems is many people no longer know how to cook. For example, one study reported that 25% of the men had absolutely no cooking skills whatsoever. It is encouraging to see the new wave of interest in cooking, numerous TV shows, but what are they actually cooking? A study in the UK compared the nutritional content of meals created by television chefs with ready meals, like TV dinners, to compare both with nutrition guidelines set forth by the World Health Organization. They looked at 100 of each, and not a single one complied with the nutrition standards. And the TV chef recipes were even less healthy than the TV dinners. Many people just don't know how to make healthy food taste good. This is not a new problem. As an editorial in the Journal of the American Medical Association bemoaned back in 1913, in the United States, vegetables are frequently boiled in a way that deprives them of their characteristic odor and toothsomeness. Villainous and idiotic are the only adjectives that can describe our methods of cooking vegetables in the United States. Is there any research showing that cooking meals at home actually improves health outcomes? Do people who cook live longer? We didn't know until now. Researchers in Taiwan found that those who cook their own food are healthier and do indeed appear to live longer. In a 10-year study, they found that those who cooked most frequently had only 59% of the mortality risk. And this took into account the exercise people got, grocery shopping, and physical function, chewing ability. So why did they live longer? Well, those that cooked ate more nutritious foods, as evidenced by their higher consumption of vegetables. The effect on mortality was much more evident in women than in men, though. It turns out that men were, with doubtful justification, more positive about the nutritive value of convenience food, so their idea of cooking was more like microwaving a Pop-Tart, whereas women who cook actually make better food choices. As one author noted, last century we began the long process of turning over to the food industry many of the decisions about what we eat. Today, our staggering rates of obesity and diabetes are testimony to the faith we put in corporations to feed us well. But the food industry is a business, not a parent. It doesn't care what we eat as long as we're willing to pay for it. Home cooking these days has far more than sentimental value. It's a survival skill. As documented in the book The Case of the Frozen Addicts, a bad batch of so-called synthetic heroin caused, within days, what appeared to be advanced-stage Parkinson's disease. Thanks to a chemical contaminant called MPTP, young men and women were left trapped inside their bodies, near complete immobility and rigidity, in some cases left only able to move their eyes. The seminal paper ended with the silver lining, that maybe this will help us find the culprit in Parkinson's. Maybe there's a similar substance out there killing off our brain cells. Because of their structural similarity to MPTP, attention turned to a class of chemicals called beta-carboline alkaloids, such as Harman, also spelled Harmane. And indeed, higher levels of these toxins are found in the brain fluid of Parkinson's patients. These beta-carboline neurotoxins have been implicated in a number of human diseases aside from Parkinson's disease, including tremor, addiction, and cancer. I already talked about the role of diet in both preventing and treating Parkinson's, but the most common movement disorder isn't Parkinson's, it's what's called essential tremor, affecting 1 in 25 adults over 40 and up to 1 in 5 of those in their 90s, making it one of the most common neurological diseases. In addition to the potentially debilitating hand tremor, there can be other neuropsychiatric manifestations to the diseases, including difficulty walking and various levels of cognitive impairment. Might those beta-carboline neurotoxins be playing a role? Well, Harmane is among the most potent of these tremor-producing neurotoxins. You expose people to these chemicals, and they develop a tremor. You take it away, the tremor disappears. What if we're exposed long-term? Well, this recent study found that those with essential tremor had much higher levels of this toxin in their bloodstream compared to those without tremor. The highest levels are found in those who have both essential tremor and cancer, suggesting Harmane may be playing a role in both diseases. And the higher the Harmane levels, the worse the tremor. How do they get exposed to these chemicals? Primarily through meat, beef, chicken, and pork, and fish, actually. So if this potent tremor-producing neurotoxin is concentrated in cooked muscle foods, is meat consumption associated with higher risk of essential tremor? Men who ate the most meat in this study had 21 times the odds of essential tremor. Just to put that in context, you go back to the original studies on smoking and lung cancer. Smoking was only linked to at most 14 times the odds, not 21. Yes, Harmane is a potent neurotoxin linked to human diseases, and cooked meats are the major source of exposure, but which meat? Like other heterocyclic amines, the levels may be highest in chicken. Blood levels of this neurotoxin may shoot up within 5 minutes of eating meat, a slice of turkey in this case. 5 minutes? It's not even digested by then. This rapid uptake is indicative of significant absorption directly through the mouth, straight into the bloodstream, bypassing the stomach, and most importantly, bypassing the detoxifying enzymes of the liver. This may lead to higher exposure levels in peripheral organs like the brain. Due to its high fat solubility, Harmane accumulates in brain tissue, and using a fancy brain scan called proton magnetic resonance spectroscopic imaging, higher Harmane levels are linked to greater metabolic dysfunction in the brains of essential tremor sufferers. Harmane is also found in certain heated plants, like tobacco. Broiled chicken breast has about 13 micrograms, and cigarettes average about 1, so a half pack of cigarettes would expose us to almost as much of this neurotoxin as serving a chicken. Grilled salmon can have as much as chicken, though fried pork appears to be the worst, with fried reindeer not far behind in the top 5. I'd also suggest not eating too many butterflies. Harmane is created when tobacco is burned, and also when coffee beans are roasted, though coffee intake has not been tied to increased risk, and neither is tobacco for that matter. So it may be something else in the meat that's to blame for the 2,000% increase in odds for this disabling brain disease. Decades ago, a group of researchers in Norway came upon an unexpected finding. Alcohol consumption was associated with liver inflammation, no surprise, but a strong protective association was found for coffee consumption. These findings were replicated in the US and around the world. Those at risk for liver disease, those who drank a lot of alcohol or were overweight and therefore at risk for fatty liver disease, appeared to cut their risk in half if they drank more than 2 cups of coffee a day. Liver cancer is one of the most feared complications of liver inflammation. Hepatocellular carcinoma is the third leading cause of cancer death. Furthermore, it has a rapidly rising incidence in the United States and Europe, largely driven by the burden of hepatitis C infection and fatty liver disease. Putting together all the best studies done to date, those drinking the most coffee had half the risk of liver cancer compared to those that drank the least. Since this meta-analysis was published, a new study found that male smokers may be able to cut the risk of liver cancer more than 90% by drinking 4 more cups of coffee a day. Of course, they could have also stopped smoking. It's like if you look at heavy drinkers of alcohol. Drinking more coffee may decrease liver inflammation, but not as much as drinking less alcohol. Liver cancers are among the most avoidable cancers, through hepatitis B vaccination, control of hepatitis C transmission, and reduction of alcohol drinking. These 3 measures could, in principle, wipe out 90% of liver cancers worldwide. It remains unclear whether coffee drinking has an additional role on top of that, but in any case, such a role will be limited compared to preventing liver damage in the first place. What if we already have Hep C, or are among the 30% of Americans with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease due to obesity, which may quadruple one's risk of dying from liver cancer? Well, coffee seems to help with hepatitis C, reducing liver damage, disease activity, and mortality, seems to help reduce the risk of developing liver cancer. Only the lack of randomized trials, interventional studies on the topic, prevents us from considering the protective effect of coffee as fully ascertained. But we didn't have such trials until now. A randomized controlled trial on the effects of coffee consumption in chronic hepatitis C. 40 patients with chronic hep C were randomized into 2 groups. The first consumed 4 cups of coffee a day for 30 days, while the second group remained coffee abstinent, and then the group switched for the second month. Now, 2 months is too soon to detect changes in cancer rates, but they were able to demonstrate that coffee consumption reduces oxidative DNA damage, increases the death of virus-infected cells, stabilizes the chromosomes, and reduces fibrosis, all of which could explain the role coffee appears to play in reducing the risk of disease progression and of evolution to cancer. So, is it time to write a prescription for coffee for those at risk for liver disease? Some say no. Although the results are promising, additional work is needed to identify which specific component of coffee is the contributing factor in reducing liver disease and related mortality. There are more than 1,000 compounds that could be responsible for its beneficial effects. That's such a pharmacological worldview. Why do we have to know exactly what it is in the coffee bean before we can start using it to help people? Yes, more studies are needed, but in the interim, moderate daily unsweetened coffee ingestion is a reasonable adjunct to therapy for people at high risk, such as those with fatty disease. Yes, daily consumption of caffeinated beverages can lead to physical dependence. Caffeine withdrawal symptoms can include days of headaches, fatigue, difficulty with concentration, mood disturbances. But this dependence could be a good thing. The tendency for coffee to promote habitual daily consumption may ultimately turn out to be advantageous if its myriad potential health benefits are confirmed. In 2013, a nutritional update for physicians was published in the official journal of Kaiser Permanente, the largest managed care organization in the United States, which covers about 9 million people with about 15,000 physicians, who were told that healthy eating may be best achieved with a plant-based diet, defined as a regimen that encourages whole, plant-based foods and discourages meat, dairy, eggs, as well as all refined and processed junk. Too often, physicians ignore the potential benefits of good nutrition and quickly prescribe medications instead of giving patients a chance to correct their disease through healthy eating and active living. Physicians should therefore consider recommending a plant-based diet to all their patients, especially those with high blood pressure, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, or obesity. The major downside is that it may work a little too well. If people are on medications, their blood pressure or blood sugar could actually drop too low, so physicians may need to adjust medications or eliminate them altogether. Despite the strong body of evidence favoring plant-based diets, Many physicians are not stressing the importance of plant-based diets as a first-line treatment for chronic diseases. This could be because of a lack of physician awareness or a lack of patient education resources. So, Kaiser sought to change that. Want to lose weight, feel better, improve, stabilize, or even reverse chronic disease? Get off some of your medications? If you answered yes to any of these questions, then a plant-based eating plan may be right for you. Side effects may include lower cholesterol, blood pressure, and blood sugar, reversal or prevention of our #1 killer, a longer life, healthier weight, lower risk of cancer, diabetes, may even slow the progression of certain types of cancer, and improve inflammatory conditions like rheumatoid arthritis. They offer tips to get started, meal plan ideas, and I'm honored to say, a good taste in websites. The paper ends with a familiar refrain: further research is needed. In this case, though, further research is needed to find ways to make plant-based diets the new normal for our patients and employees. In my video on nuts and breast cancer prevention, I featured data from the Harvard Nurses study suggesting early nut consumption may be a viable means for breast cancer prevention. A follow-up study involving the daughters of the nurses corroborated the findings. Those eating more peanut butter, nuts, beans, lentils, soybeans, or corn were found to just have a fraction of the risk for fibrocystic breast disease, which places one at higher risk for cancer. And the protective effects were found to be strongest for those most at risk, the ones with a family history of breast cancer. A new study even found just 2 handfuls of nuts a week may protect against pancreatic cancer, one of our deadliest cancers. We're not sure why they work. Nuts are described as nutritionally precious, packed with all sorts of goodies, which may explain some of the mechanisms by which nut components induce cancer cell death and inhibit cancer growth and spread in vitro, but which nuts work the best? In my video #1 anti-cancer vegetable, we learned that 2 classes of vegetables, the broccoli family of vegetables and the garlic family of vegetables, most effectively suppress cancer cell growth. Then in Which Fruit Fights Cancer Better?, cranberries and lemons took the title. What about nuts? Well, in terms of antioxidant content, walnuts and pecans steal the show. 25 walnuts has the antioxidant equivalent of 8 grams of vitamin C. That's like the vitamin C found in 100 oranges. But how do they do against cancer? Here's the graph of human cancer cell proliferation versus increasing concentrations of the 10 most common nuts eaten in the United States. If you drip water on these cancer cells as a control, nothing happens. They start out powering away at 100% growth, and they keep powering away at 100% growth. And hazelnuts, pistachios, and Brazil nuts don't seem to do much better. Pine nuts, cashews, and macadamia nuts start pulling away from the pack. Almonds appear twice as protective, having cancer cell growth at only half the dose, but these final 3 are the winners, causing a dramatic drop in cancer proliferation at just tiny doses: walnuts and pecans, with the bronze going to peanuts. This was nuts versus human liver cancer cells, like they did in the fruit study. They found similar results pitting nuts against human colon cancer cells, which is particularly useful since ingested nuts would come in direct contact with colon cancer tumors in the real world, whereas for something like breast cancer, even if nuts suppressed breast cancer growth in a petri dish, that doesn't necessarily mean nut consumption would suppress breast cancer growth in the breast, since the protective nut compounds might not even get absorbed into the bloodstream. To test that, you'd have to design an experiment where you drip the blood of nut eaters versus non-nut eaters on breast cancer, and that's exactly what researchers at Penn State recently did. And they wanted to know what it was about nuts that was so protective, so they fed people whole walnuts, just the walnut oil, or just the walnut skins, and then dripped their blood on human breast cancer cells in a petri dish over the next 6 hours, and the blood of those eating walnuts suppressed the growth of human breast cancer, but just the oil or just the skin didn't seem to. And most importantly, this data suggests that some components of walnuts are indeed absorbed, circulate in the blood, and can affect breast cancer cell proliferation. Studies like this show that those who eat the most legumes appear to have only a fraction of the risk of a form of prediabetes known as metabolic syndrome. Those that ate 3 or more servings of beans a week only had about a quarter the odds of the disease compared to those who had 1 serving or less. Yes, bean consumption is associated with lower body weight, a slimmer waist, less obesity, and blood pressure in population studies, but whether the association of bean consumption with healthier body weight and risk factors for metabolic syndrome is due to physiological effects of the beans themselves, or simply an indicator of a healthier lifestyle, was uncertain. Anyone smart enough to eat beans may be smart enough to eat all sorts of other healthy foods, so maybe bean consumption is just a marker for a healthy diet. So researchers put it to the test. Reducing belly fat may be the best way to treat metabolic syndrome and reduce the risk of prediabetes turning into full-blown diabetes. Energy restriction has been the cornerstone of most weight loss strategies. However, evidence suggests that the majority of individuals who lose weight by calorie cutting regain it during the subsequent months or years. Starving ourselves almost never works long-term. Thus, it's important to identify foods that can be easily incorporated into the diet and spontaneously lead to the attainment and maintenance of a healthy body weight and improved metabolic control. So for the first time ever, they did a head-to-head test, beans versus caloric restriction. The bean group was asked to eat 5 cups a week of lentils, split peas, chickpeas, or navy beans. So the bean group was asked to eat more food, and the cutting calories group was asked to eat less food. And the more food group won. Not only was regular bean consumption as effective as portion control in reducing prediabetes risk factors like slimming waistlines and better blood sugar control, but the bean diet led to additional benefits beyond just calorie reduction, perhaps due to some functional properties of pulses, which are beans and peas. In conclusion, 5 cups a week of beans, chickpeas, split peas, and lentils in an ad libitum diet, meaning they weren't told to change their diet in any other way, reduced risk factors of metabolic syndrome, and these effects were equivalent, and in some instances stronger, than telling people to cut 500 calories from their daily diet. These results are encouraging news for individuals with or at risk for type 2 diabetes, since they indicate that simple diet changes, such as the inclusion of beans, can have a positive impact on blood sugar control. How did doctors treat diabetes before insulin? Almost 1,000 medicinal plants were described as anti-diabetic agents, most of which have been used in traditional medicine, and these included beans. Of course, just because something's been used for centuries doesn't mean it's safe. Other treatments for diabetes have included arsenic and uranium. Thankfully, many of these remedies fell by the wayside, but scientific interest in the anti-diabetic potential of beans never vanished completely, and even was raised in the past decade. Health authorities from all over the world universally recommend increasing the consumption of whole grains and legumes for health-promoting diets. And one of the reasons is that they may decrease insulin resistance, the defining trait of type 2 diabetes. Diabetes is a global public health epidemic. Although oral hypoglycemic medications and injected insulin are the mainstay treatments of diabetes and are effective in controlling high blood sugars, they have prominent side effects and fail to significantly alter the course of diabetic complications. Common side effects include weight gain, swelling, liver disease. But I want to emphasize that second part. The mainstay of diabetic treatment fails to significantly alter the course of diabetic complications. Shouldn't that be the whole point of treatment? Thankfully, lifestyle modifications have proven to be greatly effective in the management of this disease, and if there's one thing diabetics should eat, it's legumes, beans, chickpeas, split peas, and lentils. The European Association for Study of Diabetes, the Canadian Diabetes Association, and the American Diabetes Association all recommend the consumption of dietary pulses as a means of optimizing diabetes control. What are pulses? They're peas and beans that come dried, so a subset of legumes, so excluding green beans and fresh green peas, which are considered more like vegetables, and also excluding the so-called oil seeds, soybeans and peanuts. This review compiled 41 randomized controlled experimental trials, including more than 1,000 patients, corroborating the official Diabetes Association nutrition guidelines recommending the consumption of pulses as a means of optimizing diabetes control. Any better than any of the others? Well, some of the strongest evidence came from the studies that used chickpeas. And in terms of beans, pintos and black beans may beat out kidney beans. Compared to the blood sugar spike of straight white rice, black beans and rice, and pinto beans and rice appeared to beat out kidney beans and rice. This may be because dark red kidney beans can have lower levels of indigestible starch. One of the reasons beans are so healthy is they contain compounds that partially block our starch-digesting enzyme, which allows some starch to make it down to our colon to feed our good gut bacteria. In fact, the inhibition of the starch-eating enzyme amylase, just by eating beans, approximates that of a carb-blocking drug called acarbose, sold as Precose, a popular diabetes medication. The long-term use of beans may normalize hemoglobin A1c levels, which is how you track diabetes, almost as well as the drug, without drug side effects, with names like acute generalized exanthematous pustulosis. Over the last decade, more than 5,000 papers have been published about TOR, an enzyme inhibited by the drug rapamycin, a drug used experimentally to extend lifespan, but already in use clinically to prevent the rejection of kidney transplants. Patients who received rapamycin due to kidney transplantation had a peculiar side effect, a decrease in cancer incidence. In a set of 15 patients who had biopsy-proven Kaposi sarcoma, a cancer that often affects the skin, within 3 months after starting rapamycin therapy, all cutaneous Kaposi sarcoma lesions had disappeared in all patients. This makes sense, given that TOR functions as a master regulator of cellular growth and proliferation. For example, TOR is upregulated in nearly 100% of advanced human prostate cancers. Maybe that's why dairy consumption has been found to be a major dietary risk factor. We used to think it was just all the hormones in milk, but maybe prostate cancer initiation and progression is also promoted by cow's milk stimulation of TOR. Our understanding of mammalian milk has changed from a quote-unquote simple food to a species-specific endocrine signaling system, which activates TOR, promotes cell growth and proliferation, and suppresses our body's internal house-cleaning mechanisms. Now, normally, milk-mediated TOR stimulation is restricted only to infancy, where we really need that constant signal to our cells to grow and divide. From an evolutionary perspective, it can be concluded that the persistent abuse of the growth-promoting signaling system of bovine milk by drinking milk over our entire lifespan maintains the most important hallmark of cancer biology, sustained proliferative signaling. Grow, grow, grow. TOR appears to play a role in breast cancer, too. Higher TOR expression has been noted in breast cancer tumors and associated with more aggressive disease, and lower survival rate among breast cancer patients. This could explain why women hospitalized for anorexia may end up with only half the risk of breast cancer. Severe caloric restriction in humans may confer protection against invasive breast cancer by suppressing TOR activation. But we don't have to starve ourselves to suppress TOR. Just reducing animal protein intake can attenuate overall TOR activity. Moreover, plants emphasizing plants, especially cruciferous vegetables, not only decrease TOR activation, they also provide natural plant-derived inhibitors of TOR in broccoli, and green tea, and soy, and turmeric, and grapes, along with other fruits and vegetables such as onions, strawberries, blueberries, mangoes, and the skin of cucumbers. Maybe that's why plant-based diets are associated with lower risk for many cancers, the downregulation of TOR. So are we finally on the threshold of being able to fundamentally alter human aging and age-related disease? Only time will tell, but if the pace and direction of recent progress are any indication, the next 5,000 studies on tour should prove very interesting indeed. Acne is an epidemic skin disease of industrialized countries, reaching prevalence rates of over 85% of teenagers. In the U.S., acne nowadays persists even after adolescence into the third decade of life in nearly half of men and women. But it's considered a disease of Western civilization, meaning in some places, like Okinawa, it was rare or even non-existent. In this regard, most common acne is not some physiological phenomenon of puberty, but may represent a visible risk indicator pointing to aberrant nutrient signaling promoting chronic epidemic diseases of civilization. This is what they mean. The dairy, junk foods, meat, and egg proteins in Western diets all conspire to raise the activity of the enzyme TOR, contributing to acne and obesity. So using diet to suppress TOR may not only improve acne, but may prevent the march to more serious chronic TOR-driven diseases of civilization. So the excessive TOR stimulation induced by the standard American diet may first just manifest as premature puberty and acne, but then may contribute to obesity and diabetes, cancer, and Alzheimer's. A lot of this is relatively new. Until recently, for example, only a weak association has been accepted for the role of milk and dairy products in acne formation, but there is now substantial evidence supporting the effects of milk and dairy products as enhancers of acne aggravation. Milk is not just food, but appears to represent a most sophisticated hormone signaling system activating TOR, which is of critical concern given that TOR is recognized as a fundamental driving force for a number of diseases. But if milk is naturally supposed to stimulate TOR, why the problem? Because we're drinking milk from the wrong species. Cow's milk is designed for calves. Cow infants grow nearly 40 times faster than human infants. Cow's milk has 3 times more leucine, the primary activator of TOR, so it may lead to human TOR overstimulation. It's like where they do experiments giving donkey milk to rats to see what happens. It makes no sense. And of course, milk is for babies. Continued consumption of any kind of milk after childhood, during adolescence and adulthood, is something that never really happened naturally and may have long-term adverse effects on human health. In this regard, it's kind of frightening to realize that more than 85% of teens in Western countries exhibit acne. This implies that the majority of our population is living with overactivated TOR signaling, a major disease-causing factor, which probably may pave the way for the development of other more serious diseases. A history of acne has been associated with breast cancer risk in women, for example, and prostate cancer in men. So, early dietary counseling of teenage acne patients is thus a great opportunity for dermatology, which will not only help to improve acne, but may reduce the long-term adverse effects of Western diet on more serious TOR-driven diseases. So, just like urologists use erectile dysfunction as an opportunity to save lives by putting people on heart-healthy diets, dermatologists can use acne as a way to save lives by putting people on a cancer prevention diet. So, how do you turn acne on and off via dietary manipulation of TOR? A comprehensive dietary strategy to treat acne can only be achieved by higher consumption of vegetables and fruits, given preliminary evidence for the effectiveness of natural plant-derived TOR inhibitors in the treatment of acne, and the reduction of animal-derived food. Dr. Esselstyn's landmark study showing even advanced triple vessel coronary artery disease could be reversed with a plant-based diet has been criticized for being such a small study. But the reason we're used to seeing such large studies is that they typically show such small effects. Drug manufacturers may need to study 7,000 people in order to show a barely statistically significant 15% drop in ischemic events in a subsample of patients, whereas Esselstyn got a 100% drop in those who stuck to his diet. All the more compelling, given that those 18 participants experienced 49 coronary events, such as heart attacks, in the 8 years before they went on the diet. And these are the worst of the worst, most of whom having already failed surgical intervention. And so when the effects are that dramatic, how many people do you need? Before 1885, symptomatic rabies was a death sentence until July 6th, when little Joseph Meister became the first to receive Pasteur's experimental rabies vaccine. The results of this and one other case were so dramatic compared with previous experience that the new treatment was accepted with a sample size of 2. So dramatic compared with previous experience, no randomized controlled trial was necessary. Would you, having been infected by a rabid dog, be willing to participate in a randomized controlled trial when being in the control group had a certainty of a most awful death? Sadly, such a question is not entirely rhetorical. In the 1970s, a revolutionary treatment for babies with immature lungs called ECMO, extracorporeal membranous oxygenation, transformed mortality in these babies from 80% down to 20% nearly overnight, from 80% dead to 80% alive. Despite this dramatic success, they felt forced to perform a randomized controlled trial. They didn't want to. They knew they'd be condemning babies to death. They felt compelled to perform such a trial because their claim that ECMO worked would, they judged, carry little weight amongst their medical colleagues unless supported by a randomized controlled trial. And so, at Harvard's Children's Hospital, 39 infants were randomized to either get ECMO or not, just be consigned to conventional medical therapy. They decided to stop the trial after the 4th death so as not to kill too many babies, and that's what they did. The study was halted after the 4th conventional medical therapy death, at which point 9 out of the 9 ECMO babies had survived. Imagine being the parent of one of those 4 dead children, just as one can imagine being the child of a parent who died from conventional medical or surgical therapy for heart disease. Medical students in the United States are taught very little about nutrition. Worse yet, their training actually biases them against the studies that show the power of dietary approaches to managing disease by encouraging them to ignore any information that does not come from double-blind, randomized controlled trials. Yet, human beings cannot easily be blinded to a dietary intervention. They tend to notice what they're eating. As a result, physicians may be biased in favor of drug treatments and against dietary interventions for the management of chronic disease. Evidence-based medicine is a good thing. However, the medical profession may be focusing too much on one type of evidence to the exclusion of all others, degenerating into ignoring most of the truly important evidence-based medicine. And heart disease is the perfect example. On a healthy enough plant-based diet, our #1 cause of death may simply cease to exist. The Cornell Oxford China study showed that even small amounts of animal-based foods was associated with small but measurable increases in the risk of some of these chronic diseases. In other words, the causal relationship between dietary patterns and coronary artery disease was already well established before Ornish and Esselstyn undertook their clinical studies. The value of their studies was not so much in providing evidence that such dietary changes would be effective, but in showing that physicians can persuade their patients to make such changes, and also providing interesting data on the speed and magnitude of the change in severe atherosclerotic lesions as a result of dietary therapy. So any complaints that these studies were small or unblinded are simply irrelevant, because the evidence of the role of diet in causing atherosclerosis is already so overwhelming. Assigning a patient to a control group eating the standard American diet could be considered a violation of research ethics. Evidence of the value of plant-based diets for managing chronic disease has been available in the medical literature for decades. Kempner at Duke, John McDougall, the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, Dennis Burkitt warned us that the standard American diet is a standard cause of death and disability in the Western world for decades. Yet, Physicians in the U.S. are still busily staffing the ambulances at the bottom of the cliff instead of building fences at the top.